Okay, we're rolling.
All right, this is an interview at the Embassy Suites Hotel, Syracuse, New York. This is the 1st of May, 2007, approximately 9.
All right, let's try it again.
All right, this is an interview at the Embassy Suites Hotel, Syracuse, New York, 1st of May, 2007, approximately 9 a.m. Interviewers are Mike Russert and Wayne Clark. Could you give me your full name, date of birth, and place of birth, please?
Yeah, my name is Thomas S. Brett. My birth date is November 30th, 1942, Ithaca, New York, but I grew up in Watertown, New York.
Okay, what was your educational background prior to entering service?
I graduated from Watertown High School in 1960, and I had received a Bachelor of Science in Economics from St. Bonaventure University in 1964, and I was also commissioned in the ROTC program at St. Bonaventure in 1964, and I had received a Master of Science in Business from SUNY Albany before I went into the service. I'd also worked at a management training program for General Electric in Schenectady before I entered the service in June 1966.
All right. Now, when you entered the service, did you realize at the time you were going to go to Vietnam, or?
When I entered the service, I had a high suspicion I was going to Vietnam. In June 1966, there had been increased activity in Vietnam, and I went to the Officer Basic School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and part of the Officer Basic course at Fort Sill was escape and evasion in Vietnam, and there was some instruction at the artillery school of a new way of shooting the artillery pieces, where you'd have 360-degree capability with an auxiliary jack in the artillery piece. So after I left Fort Sill and went to, my first unit was at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and was shortly thereafter we were put on orders to Vietnam. So there wasn't much of a drama about going to Vietnam from the time I went in to the time that we were put on orders to go.
Now, when you went to Vietnam, were you assigned to a unit prior to going, or did you go as a replacement, or?
Our unit at Fort Bragg, North Carolina was assigned as a unit to go to Vietnam.
Okay.
It was the 3rd Battalion, 16th Artillery Regiment, Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and then we went, we changed our address to an APO in Vietnam in May of 1967. Well, we were put on orders in November of 1966, and then from November to January, our unit was a recipient of kids from basic training. So we gave them AIT at Fort Bragg, and we trained as a unit at Fort Bragg. Took the Army proficiency test as an artillery unit. We got new equipment. The equipment went through, was put on ship in the East Coast, went through the Panama Canal, and then the troops flew from Fort Bragg to California, and we went on a ship, the USS Barrett, from California to Vietnam.
How long was that trip?
The trip was about 6 weeks. We went from the Army base in Oakland, California, stopped in Chulai, stopped in the Philippines, and then we went to Vietnam. 5 or 6 weeks, and when we were in the Philippines was the start of the 3-day war, Israel and Lebanon, in 1967. And I remember being in the Philippines when the war started, reading about it in the Stars and Stripes. By the time we got to Vietnam, the war was over. And I was amazed at that. And we had some conversation within the officer group in our battalion operations officer how that worked. So that was my introduction into Vietnam via the Philippines.
Now, when you arrived in Vietnam, what were your impressions?
It was a beautiful country. We stopped in Vietnam at Cam Ranh Bay, at Duc Pho, and then we went to Chulai. So we could see the countryside from the sea as we went into the various ports in Vietnam. It appeared to be a beautiful colonial country. You could see some of the French architecture from the ship. And I didn't get off the ship till we got to Da Nang. Actually, we got off at Da Nang, and then we went by C-130 from Da Nang to Chulai. And we went from onboard ship to actually digging in and setting up security in Vietnam, and like overnight.
Now you were establishing a fire base. Was it already there, or were you?
We went into
establishing?
we went into Chulai. Chulai was a place that had originally been occupied by the Marines in 1965. The Marines left and went north, and there was another artillery unit, the 3rd of the 15th, I believe, was our host unit. So we were essentially shadowing them and being hosted by them till our equipment came. So we were working with that other artillery unit for about a week or two till our equipment came, and then we were on our own, and we were at a base in Chulai. We had 3 artillery batteries within the battalion, and one of the firing batteries, C battery, was at the headquarters at Chulai. A battery was north, and B battery was south. And we essentially fired west.
Now, what kind of weapons did you have?
We were 155 towed. We were towed, and they were towed by 5-ton trucks, and so we had a full complement of rolling equipment. And one of the operations what we went on that I recall early was one of the howitzers being towed, and then various transport vehicles that had bulldozers and concertina wire and ammunition. So we had a full convoy like up Route 1 in Vietnam. And we had close air support with a brigade of, I think the 1st Air Cav, and that was an ongoing towed artillery operation of the classic sense. There was a second operation that was called Hood River that was, I believe that I remember we were airlifted, the artillery pieces were slung loaded by Chinooks and the Sea Stallion Navy helicopters because the artillery pieces were so heavy. And that was an airlift operation. It was the first of its kind in Vietnam. That was part of what we had done too.
Could you go in more detail about that? Were your zones cleared that you went into?
No, we went in. Theoretically, the zones were cleared, but they're never cleared until you make sure that they're cleared. So on the initial landing, I was essentially a platoon leader with infantry / artillery, so we had to secure the drop zone, and it became secured, and then the artillery pieces came in, and the key is to get the first rounds fired. So you need 2 artillery pieces on the ground. We zeroed them in, laid the battery from the 2 artillery pieces, and then we were operational within probably an hour or 2, and then the whole battery set up within that 2-hour time frame. And as we were setting up the artillery battery, the 155 artillery battery, ammunition was being supplied by C-130s flown by the Air Force on a short runway. And the artillery, the artillery ammunition was being kicked out the back of the C-130s, and then we would go out and bring it back. The troops would bring it back. At the same time that was occurring, a battery of 105s that was under the operational control of the Vietnamese was flying overhead and got disoriented and needed a place to land. So within 3 hours, we had our own fire base. We had our 155s. The Vietnamese 105 unit had to have a place to land, so they came down and set up beside us. There was an advisor, an American advisor, with the Vietnamese 105 unit. So they came down, and we were set up as a 155 firing battery, and it was a very hectic time for about 6 or 8 hours, and then overnight we fired together. We had joint missions, and then the next day they moved to a different location.
Were you under fire at all any of that time while you were establishing your base?
We did not. No, we did not. We secured it. We operated as infantry, cleared the area. We set out patrols, but we were never fired upon.
All right. After you established your fire, how would you establish a fire base? What things did you do?
We set up. Well, I was the executive officer of the firing of the battery. So you use an aiming circle, and you have a general direction of fire. You set up the.
What do you mean by an aiming circle?
An aiming circle is like a transit. It's like a surveyor's instrument. Mm-hmm. And the surveyor's instrument would be there's magnetic north, and you always know where you always have magnetic north, and then you use the engineering method to set up the artillery pieces. You're generally firing west, and then you lay the battery, as it's called, so you have the first 2 guns firing in a direction, and then you set up, and then you line the other 4. So you'd have a left platoon, center platoon, and right platoon. You generally fired the guns either as a battery or 2 guns each. And there were times at Chulai, for example, that we would have a platoon firing H&I illumination missions over a bridge that was being, what was a popular target for the Viet Cong. We'd fire a platoon of illumination rounds. Then we had another platoon fired harass and interdiction in another area. And then we had the center platoon that was on call for the infantry that was on maneuvers. And if the infantry engaged an enemy where they needed the full battery, we could bring the left platoon, the right platoon back into fire. So I mean, we were able to do that.
So you had multiple missions, fire missions at one time?
At the same time, yes. Yeah.
Now, did you dig the guns into lunettes or anything?
The guns had 155 howitzers. As part of it, had spades. And the spades would be dug in. You'd manually dig them in with a shovel, and then because of the sandy soil, we put pierced steel plating in back of the guns to reinforce the pit. So in the recoil, the steel would assist in holding up the fortification.
Mm-hmm. Now, what were your living quarters like?
The living quarters were initially we dug in. The first night that I was there, I lived in a hole on the ground with a sleeping row or sleeping. It was a poncho liner inside a slicker. And then the second night we dug in further, and I think I was on a cot that had sandbags around it. Generally, as we upgraded the positions, the troops lived in GP medium tents that had a wooden floor and had a tent over the top of it, and that was the shelter. And then officers, my first inside dwelling was a smaller tent over a wooden frame that had a wooden floor. And as we moved and went on operations, I don't remember ever living in a shelter. I mean, I think we grabbed sleep outside. There was a fire direction center that had a tent. because of, for light security and for other shelter, but I think the Fire Direction Center was essentially an operations area. So when we were on an operation, I don't remember being inside that tent. But in the base camp at Chulai, we had a tent, and then we had the exec post where we fired, where we directed the fire. We had a substantial shelter that was built of 2x4s and timbers and had sandbags around it, theoretically to withstand a big mortar attack. Luckily, when I was there, there were no mortars that fired on us. And when I was there, this was before Tet of 1967. Tet occurred in January of 1967. So we had no infiltration. We had no we had no serious breaches of our security. I think we had some testing of our security, but at Chulai. But now on one of the operations that I spoke of, Hood River. It was Hood River, where we were infiltrated by Viet Cong on our perimeter, and they had a machine gun, and they kept rat-tat-tatting our perimeter. And the next thing we had interlocking fire from small arms. You know, the artillery battery had a perimeter. We set up small machine guns with interlocking fire and small arms fire. As we were getting probed, we caught them between our machine gun fire and stepped them in. So we took 4 or 5 Vietnamese prisoners as they were probing our battery, and we took them prisoner and followed the procedure. I remember looking in my wallet, pulling out the card of how you treat a prisoner, and we followed the procedure. We treated them courteously. We had them separated. One of the kids had pulled off his belt, and we tied the hands, and we had them separated, and we didn't allow them to speak to one another, and we then made a phone call to get somebody down to take them away, and it turns out that they had C4 in their baskets. They had baskets over their shoulders, and so the ounce of prevention was worth a pound of cure in that instance, and they were taken to the rear area and interrogated, and I know that they had C4, so we escaped that one.
Mm-hmm. No, they were in civilian clothes. They were regular Viet Cong.
They had the conical hats and the black pajamas,
yep.
And they were not uniformed soldiers.
In retrospect, looking at your training, did it prepare you for what you encountered in the reality of Vietnam?
The reality of Vietnam was an evolving situation. I think I was trained as an artilleryman very well at Fort Sill, and the job that I was in, when we captured the prisoners and we went on the missions and did the firing, I had really been taught that at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and some at Fort Bragg, but I was actually in a different job at Fort Bragg, and when I first went to Vietnam, I ran artillery, I ran ammunition convoys when I first went to Vietnam, and then got into the true artillery. What every artilleryman would like to be would be an executive officer of a firing battery, and that's what I became, and I felt I was trained for that. And there was one classic on one of the missions that we were on, where we had a time on target mission where we fired on a hill so that we so-called soften them up, so that the air mobile group would come in, occupy that hill, and then we shifted to another hill, then we shifted to a third hill. And this was all done, precisely at 5:35 a.m. and then we shifted at like 6:04 a.m. so that we were time on target, and we were firing in a very organized and rapid way. The infantry came in, and it was like, it was a textbook, would be more out of World War II than Vietnam, except in World War II they didn't have the helicopters, but it was a very well done operation.
What were your relationships like with the Vietnamese Army? Did you have much interaction with them, or?
My only relationship with the Vietnamese Army was on the situation that I mentioned, where they had come in to get a port out of the storm on that one operation. But we did not generally. I did not operate with the Vietnamese. We operated with the Republic of Korea people, with the ROCs. The ROCs were part of an operation we were on. That they provided perimeter security on one of the operations, and we worked with them some. But generally, our missions were with American troops, and we fired in support of American troops. In one instance, Mountain Yards also provided security on one of our fire bases in addition, but we didn't really interact with them.
Do you have much interactions with the local populace at all? Or?
The only interaction we had with the local populace was that we were under a requirement to buy ice from the local vendors, and that we sent our laundry to the local economy. And the laundry was sent out, I'm not sure what the day was, but there was always a question when you sent the laundry out what you would get back. I think that the whole battery would send out the laundry, and the only real way that you knew that you were getting your uniform back is because your name patch was on the tunic, and you would generally get the pants, but socks would be mismatched, and it was a way of life where the United States military, as a policy, would try to support the local economy. So you would go into town, I think maybe once or twice a week when it was secure. And by secure, that meant that the MPs had declared that it was safe to go into the town, and maybe 2 or 3 or 3 or 4 people at a time. We never went in with a large group.
Did you carry firearms with you when you went in?
I carried my TO&E weapon, Table of Organization and Equipment. My TO&E weapon was a .45 pistol, but I always carried an M16 when I was off the base. And I think going into town on those safe days, I think I probably carried an M16, because when I was not on our base, when we traveled on convoys or we went over to the Chulai base camp, we always were treated as a tactical operation, and I carried an M16.
Did you wear any body armor at all?
I had a flak vest. I had a flak jacket that I wore on convoys, and at most times in transit from one place to another. Within the base camp, I don't recall wearing the flak jacket. And when we were on operations, when we were actually out set up, I don't think we wore flak jackets.
We just interviewed someone that was on one of the armored trucks. They plated the truck up. Did any of your trucks that you have, did they have any extra plating or armament on them? Our response to the big thing in Iraq now are the improvised explosive devices. In Vietnam, there were landmines, and there were explosives that were improvised by the enemy, where they would hook up dud artillery rounds with along the way that acted as IEDs. And our response to that was to put sandbags on the floors of the Jeeps and sandbags on the floors of the trucks. Where the troops sat along the back, I believe there were sandbags underneath. But the defense that we had for
for ambushes was that all the canvas was always off the truck. And the canvas was off so you could get out of the side and out of the front. And that was the way that we operated.
Now you, in your forum here, you said that within a routine of operations of an artillery battery, parts of a day or days could be perilous, intense, surprising, exhausting, boring. What do you mean by that? Could you go into detail?
Yes. There was a fellow, Michael D'Agostino, who was from Detroit, Michigan, was my RTO when I was in the artillery base.
Now what do you mean by RTO?
He was a radio telephone operator, but he was essentially the right-hand man in the exec post. And it always seemed like Mike was working at night, and he was to my right, and I was to his left, and it was, and one night he said to someone, "Lieutenant Brett hasn't given up smoking, he's just given up buying." And that's when I realized the tenseness. I was not a smoker, but he was, and he had the cigarettes, and I'd smoke. And it was just what you're waiting for the fire missions, waiting to see what was going to happen next. As I mentioned, we had the illumination going to the left, other mission going to the right, and things happened at night that wouldn't happen any other time. For example, the commo went out. We had communications between the exec posts and the guns, and the mantra of the artillery is you move, shoot, and communicate. And if you can't communicate, you can't move or shoot. And the commo went out. A truck ran over the wire, and instantly, it seemed like instantly, D'Agostino went out and patched the wire together. In the meantime, something else was going on. And at night, it wasn't like you were sitting in a lighted room. Everything was dark except for the bare necessity. So that was the tenseness. And then you might go, for example, for days where you would not either be on a mission or you would not have contact with the enemy. And so that's where the boredom would set in. But there were also times when they would say, for example, where we were going to be go out as a airborne or helicopter lifted artillery battery. Well, nobody had done that before. Well, they said, "Well, sea battery, you're going to be doing that, Tuesday," and today was, Friday. So we figured out how to do it and what it would take, and we were told that in order to make this work, the helicopters would have to be in at 4 o'clock in the morning so that there'd be enough density of the air to. So that was that was an innovative, exciting time, and we had no training for that. I had not had any training for that, but engineers talked to us about it. We went over to the base and found out what a Chinook helicopter was and how many troops would fit on it. So that when we took off, little did I know, on Friday, that my job on the first landing was going to be as the platoon leader to secure the area. So that was that was an exciting, innovative time. And also, part of the downtime, there was a USO show. There were USO shows occasionally at Chulai. There was an amphitheater that was built by the Seabees that was used for Bob Hope's Christmas show. And there was one occasion that we went over on I think it was a Sunday actually. It was a Sunday afternoon show, and it was a woman, Mrs. Miller was her name, Mrs. Miller, who was popular for being singing off key and making a parody of rock and roll.
Ed Sullivan show she used to be on.
But Mrs. Miller and the Good Guys, they were called, put on the USO show at Chulai, and and there we are, it's about 100 degrees out, sitting on your helmet, sitting on a helmet, having the M16 across your leg, and here's Mrs. Miller doing the best that she could to entertain the troops. And as part of the group, they had go-go girls. They had a couple of go-go girls from Hoboken, I'm not sure from where. And so they, so they said, well, anybody like to dance with the go? Well, there were troops up front. Of course they would, They, all of a sudden the troops are up on the stage. They were dancing with the go-go girls, and next thing the MPs had to separate the troops from the girls. So the USO show was, was ended in kind of in disarray. But when the USO show ended, we still had to go back to our job. And that was, I mean, it's not like you would go outside the theater and say, gee, what a great show it was. You go back on a truck, you go back to the base and, continue the work. But I believe, I think there were a couple of USO shows that I attended.
What was your chow like?
The food was always good that I remember. We had, we had hot meals 3 times a day, or adequate food 3 times a day when we were in our base camp. Being on an operation, we ate sea rations, and I think they were adequate also. But I didn't have any real issue with the food. I think once a week, we were close to the logistics support area, so once a week we had steaks. And they cooked the steaks out on a fire, a charcoal device of some sort. So they tried to make the most of it. And we also had cold beer most of the time. And but once we went for a long period of time without beer, and one of the troops said, this doesn't seem right. So the next thing, we had a collection. And with $150 or so, we bought pallets of beer over where we got the ammunition. You could buy a beer, and with cash we bought pallets of beer. Well, the pallets of beer were more popular than the ammunition, the small arms ammo. So we put the small arms ammunition in the trailers, put the beer in where the ammo had been, and went merrily along our way for a week or so. And then our battalion commander found out what we had and said that we have to get rid of the beer. So we ended up trading the beer for a compressor. We traded beer for concrete for the motor pool, and then we just had more beer than we could possibly drink or trade. So we took the ammo and put it back in the where the beer was, and then for a while we had the beer where the ammo had been, and over time we got rid of the beer. But that was, that was very. One of the troops came up with the idea, and then we managed. We repaid the investors their money, but we kept the beer as to be sold at the market price. I think the market price for the beer was 10 or 15 cents a can. And so we repaid the stockholders, and then the money that we made as profit became a slush fund for the troops, so that if anybody had to go home on medical emergency, there was money there for them to go. So it worked out very well.
Now, how long were you in Vietnam?
I was there for 3 months. I got wounded in the 3rd month, August 3rd. We left day after Mother's Day in 1967, and I got wounded on August 13th, 1967. Mike DiAgostino and I were burning some excess gunpowder. I think there was another troop also. And Mike was driving the truck, and the truck, we were at a pit where we had to get rid of the gunpowder, and the truck ignited like that. And Mike DiAgostino was in the front, I was on the side. I went back to try to open the door to make sure he could get out, and I went back, and finally I couldn't go back anymore. And he had already jumped over the front. So he was severely burned, I was burned. And so that was the 13th of August, and we were medevac from a field operation. It was from the Special Forces group right where we were on the operation, and then we were medevaced. We were in 3 hospitals in Vietnam, then we were medevaced to Japan, then finally Medevac to Texas.
Now you, in this forum, you had very high praise for medical service. Do you want to talk about your...
Sure. I mean, the medical service was, the burn treatment center at Texas was world renowned for its ability, and the procedures used at Texas were started in Japan when we were in Japan, and then there was a flight crew and the group in Texas worked as a unit. So as soon as we got to Japan, we were on the Brook system, and for burn treatment they used a sulfa derivative drug, sulfamylon. The main drug up till then was silver nitrate. So they used a sulfa-based topical drug for the burn treatment, and that was true. So we started in Japan, and then we went, on the flight from Japan to Texas, and then at Brook. And the people at Brook Medical Center were outstanding. There was the colonel, who was Colonel Moncrief, was the chief of the burn treatment center, and he did the triage. We came in there in the middle of the night, and he did the triage to figure out where the treatment should be and who should be sent where. And then we were put, and then at the various wards, there were doctors. My main doctor was a guy by the name of Jerry Shuck, who was from Cincinnati. There was another doctor by the name of Stein, who was, I think, from New York. And the nursing staff was tremendous. Major Mullally was one of the main nurses, and there were others, but that treatment was spectacular.
How long were you hospitalized?
I was hospitalized from August until November. And
How long was your friend hospitalized for?
he was hospitalized from August to November too, but there was a way that you could extend your medical leave, and at the end of the hospitalization, it was right around October, right around Halloween, so it was just before the end of just before November, and you got a recuperative leave, like you go home for a month or 3 weeks. And turns out Mike DeAgostino extended to make sure he got home for the Christmas holidays, so we didn't connect. When he came back, I had already been to Brook, and I was sent out back to a stateside duty assignment at Fort Devens. And the theory was to send the troops close to home. So Fort Devens, Massachusetts was close to Schenectady or to Saratoga County. And then I was there for 6 months so that the burns could heal, so that they could do the surgery, which was done at Walter Reed. And Walter Reed was a special place, a very special place. They did tremendous work there.
Going back to while you were in Vietnam, were you aware at all at that time of any drug use?
No, I was not. I learned when I went back to active duty. I was at Fort Devens, Massachusetts for the 6 months before I went to Walter Reed. And I met up with one of the soldiers who had been in our unit, and I asked him about the drug use, and he said just about the time I was wounded is when the drug use became more prevalent. And he told me that the kids that used it would smoke the dope out on the perimeter when they weren't being checked out at night. But I did not see any drug use when I was there.
How about race relations? Were there any problems at all at the time you were there? There were Spanish, black, white, and I'm not sure what other backgrounds, but people got along. I thought they got along very well.
and there was respect. I thought there was respect among the various backgrounds.
How about the anti-war movement? Did you have any problems at all? Were you aware of it?
I was aware of it. When we went from the plane to the buses in San Francisco to get to the ship, there were people out there protesting the first of the flower children.
This is when you were leaving.
This is in May of 1967, and I was aware of it, and we would receive. We got the Pacific edition of the Herald Tribune, and we'd get our battalion surgeon would get Newsweek and Time, so we were aware of the anti-war sentiment.
Did you have personally any encounters? Now you came back differently than others did, so did you ever have any encounters yourself?
No, I did not have any encounter. Nobody treated me rudely or abruptly or in any other way. There were some people that expressed their views in a positive, expressed their views in a positive way, but I did not have encounter any animosity or any harmful kind of treatment when I returned.
Now, how long you were in the service until July of '69? What were your other assignments?
Okay, when I went from Fort Devens, Massachusetts to Walter Reed in May of 1968, and so I was in Walter Reed from May until August of '68. Then I went on active duty to Fort Meade, Maryland, where I was in the operations office of Fort Meade, where they did riot control for the main function was to do riot control and security for Washington D.C. and Baltimore during that tumultuous time of 1968, and then I went back to Walter Reed from December of 1968, and then went back to Walter Reed in the spring of 1969, and so I was discharged. I was really discharged coincident to the end of my medical treatment at Walter Reed, and then I went to law school in the fall.
Now, did you use the GI Bill?
Yes. Yeah, the GI Bill at that time was an incentive. I mean, I forgot what the numbers were. The GI Bill was an incentive to go to school. It wasn't as nearly as rich as the one for World War II, but yeah, but there was a GI Bill, and it was very, very helpful. And also, the state of New York was very, very helpful to veterans too. I went to SUNY Buffalo, and New York State, I believe, had a tuition program for veterans, and I don't recall what that was, but I thought that it was. I mean, I thought it was all fairly done and positive. I'm very positive about that.
Did you join any veterans organizations at all?
Yeah, I am now a member of the Vietnam Veterans Leadership Program of Central New York, and our job is to raise scholarship money for children of Vietnam veterans, the Vietnam veterans who were actually on the ground in Vietnam. And so I've been a member of that organization for 15 years. And we have a luncheon every year around Veterans Day. We have speakers who come in and talk about the Vietnam War and what, and some of them are well-known writers and authors and active people. So it was very, very, very positive. It's a plus. We raise money for education, and it's a positive way to stay in contact with Vietnam veterans.
Now, how many or who did you stay in contact with after the war that was served with you?
I did not stay in touch with anybody that really served with me. I've stayed in touch with, it's interesting because when I was at Walter Reed, people stopped by to see me. My battery commander was Bill Hannon from Hastings on Hudson, New York. I thought he was a wonderful leader and a very good soldier and a good guy. He stopped at Walter Reed to see me. There was another kid by the name of Capodice who stopped when I was at Brooke Army Medical Center. And there was another fellow, Wayne Childs, who from Virginia. And then after that, I just didn't stay in touch any longer. And I don't know why that is. But as I mentioned earlier, I got in touch with Mike D'Agostino over the last couple of years. And there were people that I'd gone to St. Bonaventure with and friends that I had met, including my high school friend John Burchett from Watertown, New York, who's himself an artilleryman. So I've stayed in touch with people who have served, just not people who were with me in Vietnam.
Do you ever read much about Vietnam?
I read some about Vietnam. The most significant books that I read about Vietnam, of course, the Best and the Brightest by David Halberstam, and then the Bright Magnificent Lie by Neil Shahan, and I forget the other author. But,
Yeah.
But those books in particular, and We Were Soldiers Once and Young by General Moore, and Joe Calloway. Joe Calloway spoke to our group. General Moore, we tried to get General Moore to speak to us, but he's apparently infirmed right now. So,
How about movies? Do you ever watch any of the movies?
I try to stay away from the movies on Vietnam. I don't. I've seen a couple, but I don't watch them.
Okay. How do you think your time in the service changed or had an effect on your life?
I think it was one of the most significant events of my life. Having to have gone through it, to have experienced the government of the United States, not in its most shining moment, but we continued as a democracy. I personally benefited from working in the Army and learning from the experience, and I carried things over in my business life that I learned in the Army. I carry with me a card that we got in the service, and it is the Standing Orders of Rogers Rangers, and it comes from a Major Robert Rogers from the French and Indian War, who was disgraced in the Revolutionary War. But these were the standing orders of Rogers Rangers that we had with us in Vietnam. I use them occasionally now. I've given them to others, and it has to do with preparedness, awareness, and steadfastness. And I think I learned that in the military, and I carried that through in my professional life.
Okay. If you could hold this up and tell us about this photograph, where and when this was taken.
At the time this photograph was taken, I was Lieutenant Thomas S. Brett. I was 050-19685, which was my serial number, and it was on this duffel bag in which I carried my belongings. All my belongings, including a pair of Bermuda shorts and a t-shirt, and were in this duffel bag. And this was my first home away from home, which is a small tent in Chulai, South Vietnam. My roommate in this tent was Captain William Hannon, and it had sandbags around the perimeter to ensure or assure us, maybe I don't know that they would have done any good, but it felt a lot better than not having them. And it seemed like it was a comfortable place to be at night. One night there was an incoming round, one night actually there was an outgoing round. There was a battery that fired over us, and Bill Hannon and I met one another at the post going out, and I was about 50 pounds heavier than he was, so I got out first. I remember that, but we were never in any serious harm while I was there. we used to use the sandbags as a place to shave in the morning, get cold water, shave out of a helmet. It was like being on a camping trip for the first week, and then we wondered where the hot water was on those other days. But that was a very interesting time. We carried sidearm. I carried a .45. I carried a canteen, and had a pistol belt at all times. In my left breast pocket was a notebook, and that was generally the uniform of the day was, you know, the uniform of the day was jungle fatigues. I know that I never wore a Class A uniform the whole time I was in Vietnam. Class A being khaki or other dress uniform. My uniform was the jungle fatigues.
Okay.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your interview.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we're rolling.
Right, this is an interview at the Embassy Suite, Syracuse. It is the 4th of June 2007, approximately 4 p.m. This is a second interview. Could you give me your name, please?
Yep, my name is Thomas Brett, B-R-E-T-T.
Okay. Now, you told us something about prisoners, and you wanted to add something to that from the last interview?
Yes. When I was last interviewed, we talked about the unit I was with, the Charlie Battery, 3rd of the 16th Artillery in Vietnam, and we took prisoners. We took 4 to 5 prisoners on a day on an operation as we were setting up to fire in support of the 101st Airborne. And since May 1st, when I was first interviewed, and today, I've met up with Michael D'Agostino, the soldier that was wounded with me, and we discussed the taking of the prisoners. And the prisoners came within our interlocking fire on the perimeter. We had machine guns on the right and on the left, and these Vietnamese came within the interlocking fire, and they were marched into our battery area, and we took them prisoner. At the time, I was the executive of the battery. They came into our immediate area, and there was quite a bit of commotion as we were trying to set up our guns, and the enemy was captured. And there was Lieutenant Paul Harper, and asked, what do we do now? And so I reached into my wallet, pulled out a trustee card from the Army. It's called The Enemy in Your Hands, and it gives overall guidelines on what to do with the enemy, to disarm the prisoner, immediately search him thoroughly, require him to be silent, segregate him from other prisoners, and the things that you cannot do and must not do. It said mistreat your prisoner, humiliate or degrade him, and so on. So there's a fold-up card that gave guidance.
Do you want to hold that up and I can zoom in on it?
Sure.
Okay, can you just turn that right side up? So the MACV symbol, yeah, that's
okay.
Just like that. Okay, yep, I can focus right in on that. You want to just turn it over to the other side of it? Okay.
And so after Lieutenant Harper and I had our discussion, and we separated the prisoners, we tied them with belts, and I believe that we used the belts that we were wearing at the time, and separated them. And then there was another admonition in the brochure to take the captive quickly to security, which that meant was calling up the battalion headquarters and saying, what do we do next? And then I think that someone came from battalion headquarters, or the regimental headquarters where we were, and took the prisoners from our operational area. And so I wanted to make sure that I talked about that.
Do you ever know what happened to the prisoners after they left you, or?
The prisoners, after they left us, it was determined that that indeed within the baskets that they carried, they had C4 explosive materials, and I think there was some other ammunition that they had. And it was determined that they had weapons. I mean, they were actually penetrating our area with small arms fire, and I think some other, it might have been AK-47, but I don't remember. I remember that they had the C4 materials, and we were, based upon the admonition from the Army, I was worried that they may have had fish or some other food stuffs in there. So we kept everybody separate, and we followed the procedure, and luckily there was no retaliation or there were no injuries by the prisoners against us. And I think we did treat them humanely and followed the direction, and they moved up to the higher headquarters.
Were you ever your group ever receive an accommodation for this, or?
No, I think, no, it was all,
Okay.
it was all pretty much in a day's work. I mean, we did, amazingly, as you read about Iraq and what I've read about World War II, we did an awful lot of things that the units did in World War II that they've done in Iraq on a daily basis, or semi-regular basis. I mean, we had multiple fire missions going on at the same time. We had an airlift that was unique in Vietnam, where the artillery pieces we had, the 155 towed artillery pieces, were not to be airlifted, and due to the mission we were on, they figured out a way to use heavier helicopters, heavier air in the morning. We airlifted the artillery pieces, and then we went into a hot DZ and set up firing. And again, with Mike D'Agostino, when I spoke to him a couple of weeks ago, he and I were in the lead helicopter to secure the DZ, and he was talking to my wife, and he said, and we were 4 feet off the ground, and Lieutenant Brett said, "Now we have to jump." Well, we had reviewed that. We had talked about how we were going to do that, but when it came down to the final, you're looking at the ground and you've got a pack on, and all of a sudden you're jumping out of the helicopter. I mean, that's what we did. So I think that we did a lot of first-class military soldiering while we were there.
Okay. All right, the other thing you wanted to talk about, we talked about toward the end of your interview about how you felt you were treated when you went home.
Yes.
By the populace, I guess, everyone. Yeah. You wanted to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think that from my personal experience, when I got home, I was treated very well. I particularly had strong family support. My sister, my parents were very supportive. My brother was in ROTC, and so as I got out of the Army in 1969, my brother was on his way to Vietnam. So our family was involved in the Vietnam War. I had a brother-in-law who was in the Navy. My two uncles were in World War II, and they were very supportive of me coming home. I had a family, our family physician was a World War II veteran, and he was a doctor from Watertown, New York, Dr. Charles Goodenough, and he took a look at my hands, arms, and scars, and he knew that there was going to be additional hospitalization, and his strong advice was to get to Walter Reed. So in my very early weeks at home after being discharged from Pork Army Medical Center, I was encouraged to be an advocate for myself for further medical treatment, and eventually after service at Fort Devens, Massachusetts, I went to Walter Reed, where I was a patient on and off for about a year, 9 months to a year, and I was treated very well there, very well by my friends, and I had good friends who were in the service and whose families were in the greater Washington, D.C. area. So I thought I had very good support.
How do you feel about how you were, the hospital treatment itself at Walter Reed?
Walter
We
Reed,
talked about that a little bit.
yes, the Walter Reed treatment I thought was outstanding. There were 2 hand surgeons that worked on me particularly, a doctor by the name of Fred Tomlinson and his colleague by the name of Peterson, whose first name I can't recall. And they were excellent. They were excellent surgeons. They were trained with the latest technique. I think there were 2 or 3 other plastic surgeons at Walter Reed who had been drafted, but they came at it like we were their patients, and they did a great job. And at Brook Medical Center, there were doctors who had been drafted from private practice, and they did tremendous work in the burn treatment center at Brook.
Are there any other additional things you'd like to?
No, I think that this is it. I mean, this is a great interview, and I appreciate the opportunity to amend my earlier interview.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'd like to see if I can
Sure.
get a copy.